Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm Danny.
And we're seriously nerdy about all the things.
A lot of stuff, including the Cartoon Network special, Over the Garden Wall. How about the fairy tale about a woman who got mad about her lettuce being stolen, so she locked a baby in a tower?
Oh, the Brothers Grimm. If you're not familiar with Over the Garden Wall, it's a short 10-episode cartoon series that came out on Cartoon Network back in 2014.
The story follows two brothers in a fantasy setting as they try to get back home with some very unexpected twists. It is delightful and full of so much whimsy and really lovely life lessons for people of every age.
I tell people it's like a modern fairy tale.
Yeah.
You don't get a lot of modern fairy tales on account of them being written in books from olden times.
Yeah, but the olden times books have like weird stuff in it, as does this. We found these adorable lanterns at IKEA and have been sitting around saying it would be so cool to make a diorama inside of a lantern. And this finally felt like the right time.
We decided this lantern was going to be based on the first episode, The Old Grist Mill, just in case we decide to turn this into an entire series, which we might, because we keep buying these lanterns.
Cannot buy a lantern at IKEA.
Since we're trying to recreate a really specific scene from this episode of Over the Garden Wall, it made the most sense to us to use Hero Forge to sculpt the characters from scratch and put them in the exact poses that we were looking for. Danny and I love using Hero Forge for this. They have a huge library of resources, and the ability to do custom posing is just a complete game changer. Of course, you're not going to get exactly the character you're looking for. For example, I wasn't able to figure out a way to put a kettle on Greg's head, but that's definitely a problem for later on in this build.
You'll see us using Hero Forge figures for several builds this year just because the customization and the ability to pose and costume tabletop size figures is just too much fun for us to leave alone.
I started off by painting Wirt, who's the reluctant older brother. The character is really self-conscious in the show and second-guesses himself the entire time, and he's voiced by Elijah Wood, which just makes the whole process much more delightful. In this particular scene, Wirt is recoiling in surprise as the Woodsman comes across him and Greg in a clearing. I'll hike him. Fun fact, I once tried to cosplay as Wirt at a convention, but I had a beard at the time, so everyone thought that I was dressed as David the Gnome from the world of David the Gnome. I have never seen this show, but looking at reference images, I guess I can understand why people would make that association.
Apparently, it's super important to match your facial hair to your cosplays. Who knew? Hashtag boy problems.
For the Woodsman, we wanted to try to give him an operable lantern, so we ran a micro LED along the underside of his arm, all the way down his torso to his boot. Then we used hot glue to encase the micro LED and simulate the effect of a lantern globe. We used UV resin to attach the wire to his torso, and then used a very thin layer of sculpted green stuff to try to cover up where the wire was run. For the bundle of Edelwood branches that the Woodsman carries on his back, we individually UV resined a small bundle of twigs, and then tied them all together using some embroidery floss to look like rope. The Woodsman is this older, mysterious figure voiced by Christopher Lloyd, who is charged with keeping this lantern lit using the oil from the Edelwood trees. To be entirely candid, I repainted the Woodsman's clothing probably 3 or 4 times. I seem to struggle with gray and black fabrics, and I'm going to continue working on it, but after a couple of tries, I finally came to something that I was willing to settle on.
The comforting thing is that we knew that based on the position of the characters, the Woodsman would have his back turned to the viewer the whole time, regardless. But I still think he's a very handsome Woodsman.
We had some leftover green stuff from working on the Woodsman, so we used that to shape the kettle on Greg's head. The next character to paint was Greg, Wirt's carefree younger brother. Greg is the perfect counterbalance to Wirt's character. He's carefree, he charges into any situation without any thought, and he brings a lot of levity to the show. We were especially delighted that Hero Forge would let us put a frog right into his hand, since Greg is always wandering around with his pet frog.
The frog's name changes throughout the series to everything from Mr. President to Benjamin Franklin to Wirt Jr., and it's one of my favorite recurring jokes on the series. One of the things that you've seen us do quite often if you've watched any of our videos before is book reference. Internet reference is good as well, but some of the things that we are seriously nerdy about publish these beautiful art books and art guides, and they are wildly helpful not only for direct color reference, but for inspiration for things like motifs and patterns and general concepts. We are seriously nerdy about art reference books.
We ended up painting Beatrice the Bluebird, but at this scale, it's really hard to see her in the build, so she's just tucked away in the trees.
Are these not the most stunning little painted figures? He takes a long time, but Alex is such an incredible tabletop miniature painter. I'm so jealous. So it is lantern time. These are IKEA lanterns that we purchased last year from, I believe, their spring collection. And we loved the shape that it has this pentagon interior and some really wide windows for some type of a diorama. Oh, hi, Gim. As we evaluated the structure of the lantern, we realized that we were not going to be able to pry out the candle holder that sits at the bottom of the lantern. It is stuck on very well. So we decided to instead create an elevated stage out of paperboard here that we could use as the base of the diorama and just cover up the candle platform altogether. While we were at it, we did the same thing with just a flat sheet on top that would give our tree canopy something to adhere to. There was a point in this build when we thought we would be able to access everything without having to cut the lantern open, but the further we got into it and the more we realized how much we wanted very tall trees, we knew we'd have to cut open the lantern in order to be able to access and place all of these trees. They are just a collection of twigs and branches that I sanded the bases off so they had semi-level bottoms before I stuck them into some epoxy sculpt on the paperboard base. You'll notice we're clustering the trees around the points of the pentagon, knowing that that's where the supports of the lantern sit so that viewers will have very clear windows into the diorama.
Danny and I have been accumulating various tabletop greenery over the last few years, but unfortunately the color palette for our flocking and clump foliage is all over the map. On the plus side, we've noticed that a lot of the makers we follow use whatever foliage they have that matches the style they want and then just repaint it, so we're gonna try that. Sorry, Woodland Scenics, we just don't have the space or resources to have a dozen flocking shakers.
It really is amazing how quickly you can make everything feel like it's in one world just by airbrushing it all the same base color to start. When you're working in a world like Over the Garden Wall, the colors and design aesthetic are such a critical part in communicating what that environment is. So being able to take everything down to the exact color palette, it's what sells it as the correct world. So while it may seem crazy to paint everything black just to repaint it in shades of brown and green, it's one of those little things that really helps communicate the world and the environment that you're in. We hadn't originally planned on adding a lot of details to the exterior of the lantern because it was adorable as is, but when we had to cut the top off the bottom, we realized that there were jagged edges at the connection points that we would need to somehow hide or cover up. So we leaned into that idea and put some branches of idlewood and turtles on the top that could then follow with the connection point covers at the edges.
Since the original glass inserts with the lantern have this floral pattern on them, we decided to go ahead and cut out some stained glass that we liked to replace it. Now, we haven't done stained glass in a bit, but it's really important that you score it really carefully, otherwise you might... Fortunately, I had enough extra glass to work with, so I was still able to get all the panes that I needed.
While Alex was working on the glass pieces, I hopped into Adobe Illustrator to create what would become vinyl decals for the exterior of the lantern. We knew the interior would be a beautiful diorama, but if it wasn't lit, it would be a little hard to see what's inside. By having vinyl decals on the outside, it very quickly communicates the story of Over the Garden Wall, Episode 1, even if the interior isn't lit. We also loved that we could include the Beast, who's a character seen in Episode 1, as a sort of a shadow that would be behind Greg and Wirt, foreshadowing that character that makes an appearance later on in the episode. So it looks great from the exterior, but it also adds an additional story element to the interior. After I was done, I printed these out on my Cricut Joy and applied them to the glass that Alex had cut. This was the first time that we've ever used a pre-designed lighting kit in one of our builds, which means that it came with this adorable on and off switch and battery pack and programmed flickering LEDs. It was a dream to work with, which meant that we were a little bit more comfortable trying new things, like hiding the on and off switch in the actual diorama. So we're going to place the on and off switch under a little rock, because why not? The flip side of that is that we still had to make sure that all of the lights functioned as we were running them underneath the platform and up through the trees, so there was still a good amount of trial and error. Reassembling the lantern was a little bit like putting together a puzzle that's never existed before, because we had to make sure we put the figures and the electronics and the stained glass and the lantern components back together in a way that would actually function, and it was quite the puzzle. But once everything was inside and I knew the door still opened and closed, the electronics still turned on and off, I could go ahead and use epoxy sculpt to seal up the corners of the lantern and finish them off with some little details of hard candy that Greg carries around and uses in Episode 1. It turns out the powder coating that IKEA uses to finish their lanterns is incredibly resistant to airbrush paint, so we ended up masking off the windows and spray painting this with a metallic spray paint off camera, and then finishing it with some Nuln Oil to give it some distressed and antique details. The final step was, of course, adding a little turtle.
We did it! We somehow managed to fit an entire scene inside of an IKEA lantern. This video had a lot of firsts for us, including Alex's first time painting on camera.
I was so nervous.
Alex is actually a much better painter than I am. He's just much more precise. For time crunch reasons, I just knock out a very mediocre job. But now you get to see Alex's beautiful tiny figures.
I do a lot of the editing, so while Danny's painting things, I edit. Division of labor.
Division of labor.
Pulling back the curtain.
As we've said many times on this channel, we are very new to miniature electronics, so we used a group called Evan Designs, and we ordered exactly the micro LEDs that we were interested in using with flicker effects. Highly recommend taking the guesswork out of tiny, tiny lights. This was also the first time that we put the on-off switch of a project in an accessible place, which we've seen many makers do and we've been very jealous of.
During the pandemic, we tried every craft, one of which was stained glass. I completely forgot how easy it is to completely mess up stained glass, but you know, that happens.
If stained glass is something you'd be interested in seeing us do on the channel, let us know.
If you enjoyed this video and maybe want to see some more Over the Garden Wall lanterns in the future, you know, like, subscribe.
Put a turtle in the comments.
Let's head over to that final footage. Boop.
Oh, root vegetables and sugar syrup. This is not copyrighted. We did
it! Is it okay that that's what we say at the end of every video?
I just can't wait for the compilation of us saying we did it.
We did it. We did it! We did it!
We did it!
We did it!
We did it enthusiastically and with confidence.
Oh, she's so mad.
Oh boy. Oh, we got a very angry executive producer.
We'll have an episode
Heat
that's
map.
just... Oh no.
Oil painting. We're jacks of all craft trades.
You could call me Call of Cthulhu because I HP love crafts.
Wow, I didn't see that coming.